The following content is for entertainment and educational purposes only. It does not constitute means for diagnosis, healthcare advice, nor treatment. Make use of a qualified healthcare professional for such purposes.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Charlene Ortiz, and today we are going to conduct our first lecture regarding scientific literature. What is scientific literature? What are the parts that are inside that scientific literature? And you're wondering, why is it that I need scientific literature, right? Well, as you know, psychology is in the business of predicting behavior. And in order to predict behavior, we need to conduct statistical procedures, I should say. We need to conduct scientific research. In order to find out what research is vindicated, what research is substantiated, we post our literature in scientific journals. That is the reason why you are taught what a scientific journal is and how to access it. Now, when we are talking about scientific literature, we are referring to peer-reviewed journals. Can anybody here tell me what a peer-reviewed journal is? Dr. Iman is absolutely correct. The process of peer review is that you conduct your research and a group of your peers, right? A group of individuals that are in your field are going to sit down and review your research with the intent of finding out, for example, is it scientifically sound? Is it statistically accurate? Is there any malice, right? Because you could have, for example, falsified your research, twisted or tweak your statistics to make sure that you can substantiate, reject, or accept that null hypothesis. So that is one of the reasons why you will submit to a peer review. Many journals, right? There are many journals. And what is a journal, right? Is a form of publication. And in this journal is generally focused on one specific subject. So for example, you can have a journal that can be really broad, right? So for example, a journal by the American Psychological Association, or you can have something a little bit more specific, right? Because they are fine-tuned to a specific form of literature. For example, let's say the Journal of Social Work with Children. Notice that that's a little bit more specific. Depending on the field, that is the research, or I should say the journal that you want to publish under, right? So if you're conducting research about, let's say, statistical analysis, and let's say success of transgender students during their internships, right? And did that have an impact with their internship, any sort of gender-based discrimination, for example? So you probably wouldn't post that on Psychology of Engineering journal, right? That would be another journal that you would try to fine-tune your research towards. Now, we do have subfields, as I mentioned. So for instance, you can have clinical psychology, and then you can have psychopharmacology, you can have more specific, so psychopathology. So notice that, yes, you will go a little bit more into detail when it comes to these subfields. Now, there are other forms of publication. The problem is that these specific forms of publication are not necessarily the best form. Why is that? Well, because in the peer review process, you're going to have multiple individuals critiquing your work. And because of that, you're going to find the action editor. What is an action editor? The action editor is going to look at your research after it has been accepted. And it's going to say whether or not it was a desk accept. And what is a desk accept? Basically, as soon as they receive your research, they would say, there's nothing that needs to be done with your research. This research is accurate and appropriate. Therefore, let's send it out for publication. I can tell you that rarely ever happens. Usually, most research you will ever send in your life, during your lifetime, will be rejected. About anywhere between 70 and 90% of everything you ever submit will be rejected. Just letting you know. Because it is part of the peer review process to have the best type of publication available. Now, you can also have a desk reject, What does that mean? It means that your research is not considered adequate. It is absolutely rejected outright, and it will not be considered for publication whatsoever. Generally, what does tend to happen if your research is seen sound, usually will require revisions, right? So if you get past that 90% of rejection, if it is accepted, that 10%, usually you will need some revisions for your research. And then it will be published. Any questions about that? Good deal. Let's talk about another form of publication. And in this specific case, we're talking about books. The situation that we have with books is that they are academically sound, but it doesn't necessarily mean they are scientifically sound. Think about this. Anybody can publish a book, technically speaking. Anybody can. Anybody can publish a book. Therefore, it doesn't go through that process of being scrutinized by the editors, by a group of your peers. So notice that many times whenever you're working here in the field of psychology, a book reference generally is not accepted, right? Generally it's not accepted, and you're thinking, well, this was Dr. So-and-so that published it. Then again, think about Dr. So-and-so didn't have to go through that scrutiny of having his or her book rejected, right? Because it wasn't scientifically sound. I do like to make an exception about that your slides don't mention, and that is seminal works. What are seminal works, right? Seminal works are generally books that have some historical and scientific value to them. So for example, if you're quoting Maslow, right? Abraham Maslow, and you're quoting the humanistic perspective and things of that nature, it might be good to go to the original source and quote that, but only as a reference, not to found and have your research based on it. In that case, you would want scientific literature. But it's always, I would say it is okay to quote a seminal work, but be very mindful that not your entire work should be based on a book that was published, say, for example, a couple of decades ago, maybe hundreds of years ago. Always want to make sure that you look for scientific literature generally published within the last 5 years. It's usually what we recommend. If your topic is immensely rare, right, which was my case when I published my own research, in that specific case, I actually have to go back more than 5 years because not a lot of people had studied what I wanted to study. If you were wondering, my research back then was titled The Impacts of Religious Discrimination Towards Anxiety in Diverse Populations. Everything I could find about religious discrimination was based on Muslim individuals. There was nothing against discrimination towards, say, Buddhist, Jewish individuals, agnostic individuals, atheists, Christian, Baptists, Catholics. So I had difficulty in finding those peer-reviewed journals for that population. So I did have to go a little bit further. Generally, it's recommended that you look into 5 years. So Dr. Ash over here is asking, is there a universal guideline? No, there isn't. Generally, each journal has their own set of rules, right? So here, for the intents of the class and probably for the rest of your education, you're going to use the standards as given by the American Psychological Association Publishing Manual. You will see that the rest of your career. But if you are submitting to a scientific journal, each one has their own sets of rules of what they want to see published and how they want to see it. However, there is a common element to them, and that is the different parts of a research, which we cover in class, right? So the abstract, introduction, you will find that in every single article. And why is that? Because you, as a scholar, once you start getting your, now with your bachelor's, you should be able to understand research. With your master's, you should be able to apply research. With your doctorate, you should be able to create research. So if I give you a journal article right now to read, and it's about school psychology, and I give you another article, say, about social work, they roughly look the same. So you should be able to understand them. So yes, they have elements in common, but each journal is going to have their own sets of rules. Does that answer your question? All right. Good. Now, when we were referring to research articles, right? When we were referring to research articles, we do have different types. We do have different categories of journals. Now, the first category that I want to talk about is the empirical research article. What is that? That type of research article, that type of journal is going to report upon new data. It's going to report upon new data. Their interest is we're going to specialize very significantly in the method and results section because it's providing new research. It is providing a new understanding of whatever the topic is. So for example, when publishing my research, if I were to give you that example, it was new. Nobody had looked into religious discrimination with atheists or religious discrimination against Baptists or Jewish people or individuals who were Hindu. So in that case, the best publication journal would have been an empirical research article because it provides new information. Let's talk about our next category. Let's talk about our next category of journal articles, and that is review articles. Review articles are simply there to summarize existing data. And you're thinking, well, what's the point of that, right? The point is to publish new research, find out new science. Well, it's important to find out what we already have. It's important to have a review article because it's going to give me the opportunity and say, what is the general trend? So whenever we're looking at a review article, you want to find out, I wonder if religious discrimination against Muslims has decreased. Because as you know, around 9/11, right, there was a surge in research about discrimination against Muslim brothers and sisters. So notice, if you wanted to see, I wonder if that has changed, you will look into a review article journal because it can provide you a summary of what has the data suggested. Any questions about that? Fantastic. Fantastic. If we revert back to our presentation, notice that we also have letters to the editor. In this particular case, we're thinking more about, say, a contest, right? So you're trying to contest a publication. You're trying to say, I have a review for my research, bless you. You have a review for your research. So you send a letter to the editor. And that letter will be published, right? Because say, for example, you're trying to review your own research, trying to correct somebody else's research, trying to publish a biography. That will be the third category. And the last category we're going to talk about today involves that of theoretical or model papers. This particular category is basically how are we going to conduct new research. So this type of category, of journal category, is going to provide you with a perspective without collecting new data. This is simply as a theoretical model for you to inform your research later on whenever you are conducting new research. Because every interpretation you ever make about your statistical data or qualitative data for that matter, you need a theoretical framework to understand it. And I'll give you a very brief example. Think about if you have a client or a patient that shows up to your session, and this person is struggling with alcoholism. You need a model to interpret that presenting issue, right? So some of you may be psychoanalytic, saying maybe there's something about their past, maybe there's something about urges, maybe there's something about their unconscious needs that has led them to alcoholism. Whereas some of you who prescribe to the CBT aspect of therapy, which is the one that I generally use in session with my own clients, of course, I practice under supervision. I would use another theoretical model and say there is an incongruence between the behavior and the emotion and the thought. So I need to make this congruent in order to say, I don't want to drink, but I bought 3 wine bottles. Notice that there is an incongruence. My job as a therapist would be to make this congruent. The same goes for research. You find a theoretical model to understand the presenting issue, and in this case would be research. Any questions about that? Outstanding. Good deal.